Okay, guys, Lawrence here. In this video, I'm going to talk about capacity planning. Okay, so last video we talked about the how to define the queue structure, hierarchical structure of your capacity schedulers queues. In this video, we're going to explain how do we do the configurations. Now, if we already defined the queue structure, okay, and then next task is that we're going to assign the capacity. Like we explained before, are you going to give QA 80, QB 20, or going to give QA 70, QB 30% of the resources? So here's about our queue structure. So what percentage of resources you're going to assign to production and others? Okay, so let's look at the configuration items. Like before, the first two items about the queue structure, and the next item is a new property. This property defines the capacity for production queue. Okay. Excuse me. So this is how you define capacity. Again, use the name and the value. The name is yarn scheduler, capacity, route, and production. This is the queue name, and followed by a keyword capacity. Okay. So this name tells Hadoop that this property is going to define the capacity for production queue. And the value is simply a number, 40. In this case, you can interpret the value as 80 at 40%. Okay, 40%. Next property, same thing. If you read it, it's a DV capacity. So I define the DV capacity as 60. Okay, so 40, 60 sum up to 100%. So these two properties defines the resource capacity beforehand. Okay, production use 40%, DV use 60%. Okay, then you may ask, well, what about ENG and signs? So we're going to look at those as following items. We'll come back for this max capacity, but let's look at the following two properties. These two properties, same way to define the capacity, only difference I replace the queue name. And this time I put a DVENG. Then when Hadoop will read this property, Hadoop will know, well, you're defining the capacity for DVENG queue. And the number is 50%. Same thing for DV signs, 50%. So after you read these two properties, you know that ENG and the signs gonna equally, the resource gonna be equally divided between ENG and the signs. Each one of you use 50%. The question is that 50% of what? The 50% of DV's capacity. And we already know the DV capacity is 60% of whole. So eventually, the ENG and the signs each gonna take half of the 60% of resources. So each one gonna eventually take 30%. Okay, but I'm not requiring you guys to do that calculation. Simply, what I require is that you guys need to know, after reading these properties, if I give you these properties, I'm going to ask you, okay, how much resources that DV going to use? And you answer that is 60% of whole. And ENG, you're going to take 50% of the DV's total resources. Okay, that's how you defined the capacity. Okay, capacity scheduler, what's important is the capacity plan. So this is how you define those. Now let's look at this property. This property is about queue elasticity. We explained that concept in the first video. So what is the queue elasticity? Here, for a recap, is that we will allow, even though we defined the capacity beforehand, okay, we give 40 to production and 60 DV, we define the a proportion of resources beforehand. But like we explained before, we will allow any queue to use more resources than planned. Okay, especially when one queue is super busy and the other queue is not busy, then we allow the busy queue to extend the bar a little bit, use more resources than planned. That's called queue elasticity. Now, this property, the key is root DV maximum capacity. So I define the capacity for DV. This time I define maximum capacity. If you look at DV capacity property above it, I give 60% at beginning. Then this property, I define the maximum capacity as 75%. So this property simply tells Yarn that, okay, I allow DV queue to use more than its planned capacity, 60%, but no more than 75%. Okay. So DV queue originally used 60%, but if in case DV gets super busy, this queue gets super busy, but production is not busy, I will allow DV to use more than 60, start going up to eat the capacity of production, but no more than 75%. In other words, DV can use at maximum 75% of the total resources. Okay, if you have not specified this property, okay, I assume administrator of this Hadoop cluster did not specify the maximum capacity for DV, then the default is 100%. That simply means if I do not specify the maximum capacity for this DV queue, then the DV queue can use all the resources. Go back here. If I did not specify the DV maximum capacity at 75%, I simply leave out that property. By default, DV can use up all the resources of other queues. Eventually can use 100%. So in this case, since our configuration, I did not specify the maximum capacity for production queue. So in this specific case, if I ask you what eventually the production queue can use in an extreme case, then the production queue can eventually use 100% of all resources. Even though I planned 40 for production, but I did not specify the maximum capacity. So for the policy of queue elasticities, production queue can use up all the resources when production queue is super busy and the other queues are not using any resources. Okay.